Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you all for joining us. My name is David Sugarman, and I'm the organizer of this series. And I want to start by just saying a couple of quick logistical things, which I suppose will be a big theme for the evening. You will find closed captioning available by clicking on the More button in Zoom, and then the CC button should you want to have closed captioning. Also, we will be having questions and answers after the talk tonight. So please use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you might have. And we'd be very glad to get those during the talk or after for us to discuss later on. This is the second event in a series, COVID-19 and its Afterlives, which includes numerous talks and panels and a collection of essays, all of which you can find on the program website. And the link to that will hopefully be in the chat below momentarily. Please have a look at our upcoming events and at the extraordinary writings commissioned for the occasion of this series. I want to take a couple of minutes before we get started to celebrate these pieces of writing and to thank, of course, the writers, but also the archivists and librarians who helped usher them into existence. In the essays section of the website, you will find a series of letters written by Crystal Beck, who teaches gender and sexuality studies at UC Riverside. And in these letters, Crystal writes very movingly about the pandemic and how it intersects with queerness, migration, and storytelling, particularly in the life and work of Seth Hernandez Ronquillo and the Undocumented Filmmakers Collective. You will also find a piece titled Care During COVID-19, written by a writer who wanted to be identified as Asian sex worker organizer with Red Canary Song. And these two extraordinary pieces were commissioned by the APA Institute, and I'm particularly grateful to Amita Magnani for all of her help. Also published to the site is an elegiac piece by Minju Bae, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. Minju's piece considers the life and work of the late labor activist Robert Takashi Yanagida, who died during the pandemic. This piece was commissioned by the Tamman Library and Wagner Labor Archives, and I'm grateful to Shannon O'Neill and Michael Konsowicz for their great support for this project. The fourth and final essay in this writings collection that we have on the website is The AIDS Epidemic and Its Afterlives, Frank Moore and the Labors of Activist Archiving, written by Marika Sifor, assistant professor at the University of Washington. And this piece considers the legacy of the archival work undertaken and achieved by activists during the AIDS epidemic. This piece was commissioned by the Downtown Collection at Fales Library, and I'm deeply grateful to Nicholas Martin for all of his help, both with this specific piece and with this whole series more generally. The whole series is sponsored by NYU's Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity and Strategic Innovation, and my thanks to Tara Nakata and Autumn Rain in that office, NYU Center for the Humanities, and my deep gratitude to Molly Rogers there, the NYU Skirball Center, and I'm grateful to Jay Wegman as well as to Melissa Negro, who put together the incredible website for this series. At Verso Books, I'd like to thank Dan Chang and Jesse Kindig, and at N+1, I'd like to thank Mark Krodov and Lisa Borst. Thank you all. And finally, please do join us next week for The End of Policing, a talk featuring Professor Alex Vitale and Kay Gabriel. But tonight, we are so pleased to be joined by Professor Andrew Liu for a talk and Professor Charmaine Chua, who will be moderating. Charmaine Chua is assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research and teaching interests are in technology of globalization, global political economy, infrastructure studies, empire and imperialism, and ocean studies. Dr. Chua's research is concerned with the politics of global circulation, how things move, how movement is regulated, disrupted, or facilitated, and why systems that are supposed to provision life might actually distribute inequality and death. And her first book project, Logistics, Leviathan, Circulation, Empire, and the Trans-Pacific Supply Chain, explores the expansion of US-China commercial trade through the rise of logistics and demonstrates how just-in-time global supply chains are imperial infrastructures that accelerate and intensify economies of carceral, ecological, and racialized violence in the US, China, and the Asia Pacific. I am now going to hand the mic, so to speak, to Charmaine to introduce our speaker for tonight, and then to moderate afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. It's such a pleasure to be asked and invited to do this and to host Andrew and be in conversation with someone whose work I've admired for a long time. So welcome, everyone. Our time together will be for about an hour today. So we'll invite Andy to give a talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then hopefully have a discussion between the two of us for about 15. And that hopefully should leave us with enough time for 2 to 3 questions from the audience, which you should feel free to ask at any point during the talk. And so please feel free to use the Q&A function to do that, and I will moderate and pick questions and hopefully consolidate and do some of that work as the talk is going forth. So with no further ado, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Andrew Liu. Andrew Liu is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Villanova University. His research interests are in modern China, South and East Asia, histories and theories of political economy and capitalism, and global comparative history. His recently published and award-nominated, soon to probably be award-winning book, T-War, A History of Capitalism in China and India, came out in 2020, published by Yale University Press. In T-Wars, Dr. Liu seeks to rewrite the history of the global tea trade, the largest export industry in China and colonial India of the 20th century, from a non-Eurocentric perspective, seeking to understand how capitalist competition shaped economic relations and China and India's early absorption into dynamics of global capitalism. Liu's work has also been published in Past and Present, Journal of Asian Studies, Journal of Historical Sociology, Spectre, N+1, The Guardian, Mother Jones, and many other venues. And he will also have a second book coming out, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit at the end of the talk. As many of you may know, Dr. Liu is also the resident political economy and Stephen Curry expert on Time to Say Goodbye, a podcast about Asia, Asian America, and life during the coronavirus pandemic with Jay Caspin Kang and Tammy Kim. So Andrew, please take it away. Looking forward to this talk.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Charmaine, for the very flattering, overly flattering, perhaps, introduction. Thanks. Let me first say thanks to David Sugarman for the invitation. Thanks to Skirball Center for hosting and N+1 and Verso for co-sponsoring. Just to give some context for this talk, back in March 2020, I was thinking a lot about how can we take this concept of floating around, which is Chinese virus, and kind of dissect it and pull it apart and think about different ways to think about China and contextualize it within these global forces. So this time around, I kind of asked the same question, but obviously we're in a different moment than in March 2020, which led me to think about and turn my attention towards these different origins theories that are still floating around and unresolved 20 months later about the origins of COVID purportedly right in the city of Wuhan, China. So I'll talk about a lot of that in today's talk. And I'm kind of like testing out some ideas I've been kind of playing around with or experimenting with the last few weeks. And I think this talk, the full argument that this would imply would probably exceed the time limits of this talk. I think in this talk, I'll try to like point out ways we could think about the role of China today differently, but in terms of showing how to think differently, right, that might actually require more. And hopefully Charmaine and I will get into some of these details in the conversation that follows. Okay, so I'll kind of begin there. Compared to about 20 months ago, it is remarkable today how infrequently Wuhan, China, the original epicenter of COVID-19, is mentioned in the news. The city itself has moved on. The Huanan seafood market has remained closed since New Year's 2020, while new ventures for electric vehicle and mobile phone manufacture have sprung up in the city's export processing zone. Last month, the New York Times reported that vaccinations across all of Asia are quickly outpacing those in Europe and the US. Quote, Asians have trusted their governments to do the right thing. They were willing to put the needs of the community over their individual freedom, end quote. China and Asia's reputation as a whole has undergone a sort of reversal over the course of the pandemic. Originally, it was scapegoated as the birthplace of COVID-19, but now it's seen as the pandemic's political and economic winner, right? In this talk, I'll try to suggest that both of these approaches, both demonization and romanticization, have clear shortcomings. Both fetishize and exceptionalize China or Asia more generally in ways that obscure these deeper global forces and dynamics. So in this first section, I'm going to look at the divergent fate of the two major theories for COVID-19's origins. We have the wet market theory that's kind of been already sidelined since 2020, and the newly popular lab leak theory that gained new life this past summer. I'll try to connect these theories to the specific kinds of Orientalism that have encompassed East Asia in recent decades. In the second half of this talk, I'll try to gesture towards ways we can think about China and think about its interdependence with the global economy, moving beyond national or racial analysis. And this will hopefully point to more productive ways to think about major recent news stories, from the collapse of real estate developers in China to the current disaster facing global supply chains. Okay, so in terms of the origin theories, last spring, as scientists and journalists debated the virus's origins, they settled upon the so-called wet market theory, right? This theory said that COVID-19 naturally emerged at the Huanan market in Wuhan, crossing over to humans from a wild animal, most likely a pangolin. However, mentions of wet market on US television news reached an apex in April 2020 and basically disappeared ever since then. Replacing wet market was the theory that COVID-19 was intentionally designed in the Wuhan Institute of Virology as part of dangerous gain of function research and experiments, and then leaked out into the rest of society. And this is basically the sole public reminder of the name Wuhan in the public today. Now, this lab leak theory was first auditioned by Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo last spring, but it was quickly denounced as more Trumpian racism, basically. The theory gained new life this May, however, when journalists began to wonder if they had been blinded by partisanship. This past summer in 2021, lab leak was mentioned in the news even more than wet market ever had been. And this led to new Senate hearings, an investigation by intelligence agencies, and perhaps most tellingly, promulgation by the conscience of middle-class liberalism, the comedian Jon Stewart. In the US, many have pushed back on both theories, lumping them together, right? The accusation is that both of them recklessly fuel anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism. The organization, quote, the organization titled Stop AAPI Hate, recorded 3,000 incidents of anti-Asian racism this spring alone. It is notable that in a national survey, Asian respondents perceive the violence, the uptick of violence, mostly as a byproduct of Trump's, quote, Chinese flu rhetoric, or more generally, racial scapegoating for the pandemic. New York Times science reporter Apurva Mandavili tweeted that the lab leak theory, quote, had racist roots. Liana Wen, a Chinese-American physician, wrote in the Washington Post, quote, words matter, and, quote, unproven speculation into the Wuhan Institute's role would fuel anti-Asian hate. Now, these conversations are important, of course, but they also rarely acknowledge the distinction between the wet market theory and the lab leak, and the wet market theory and the lab leak theory. The wet market theory has been sidelined in polite society. The lab leak theory is now acceptable across the political spectrum. If the two theories have experienced these divergent fates, then I think it is instructive to explore why. Both theories may traffic in racial stereotype, but these are distinct, even diametrically opposed forms of racial stereotype as well. So first, the wet market theory. Last spring, this theory and articulations of this theory embodied many of the classic Orientalist caricatures we're familiar with of Asian societies as exotic and backwards. Exemplary was this article from the National Review that claimed, quote, wet markets in China butchered meat in unsanitary conditions. Unhygienic practices were the result of Chinese superstitions that use wild animals as, quote, supposedly magic ingredients in tonics and alternative medicines, right? And you can imagine there's many more of these examples, right? But this is just a juicy example to start off with. Now, these are not simply fringe voices. At the time, these were sentiments echoed by Anthony Fauci, Dr. Anthony Fauci, United Nations officers, United States lawmakers. Most bluntly, perhaps, was an Italian official who said, quote, we have all seen the Chinese eating mice alive. Now, again, these are the recognizable ingredients of the sort of classic Orientalism many of us are familiar with or perhaps have read about in the works of Edward Said, right? Trafficking in accusations of barbarism, disease, superstition. Pushback, of course, soon followed, and many pointed out that many of these practices in the so-called exotic wet markets could be found across Europe and the US and the rest of the world as well. By last June, the prestigious journal, The Lancet, challenged this demonization by citing the specter of xenophobic racism and, quote, anti-Asian sentiments. And this, I believe, is kind of the liberal common sense. We don't really hear about wet markets anymore, and we're kind of immediately triggered to think that this is a racist trope, right? Now, for all the criticisms of wet market, however, what seems to have gone unacknowledged is just how antiquated and out of touch it was with the world's dominant image of China today. The Orientalist tradition analyzed by Edward Said, for instance, was the handmaiden of British and French colonialism in the 19th century, used to justify occupation and domination. But China and East Asia, they were never a proper colony in the mold of, say, South Asia or the Middle East. The classic Orientalist framework has always been an awkward fit. A different Orient, therefore, has inspired a different Orientalism. So here I find it useful to turn to concepts developed by the literature scholar Colleen Lai, who articulated a distinctive, quote, Asiatic racial form, which grew dominant in the imagination of US literature at the turn of the 20th century as the westward frontier expanded across the Pacific Ocean. In the 1870s, Chinese workers in California were scapegoated as super cheap, superhuman workers, resulting in policies of exclusion. The victory of Japan over Russia in 1905 inspired fantastical speculation about the region's threat to the white race, right? The novelist Jack London penned an article titled, quote, If Japan Wakens China in 1909, warning that a marriage of martial Japan and industrious China would be an existential threat. It was precisely this dystopian fear that reemerged at the turn of this current century, in the 21st century, when China joined in the Japanese-led economic miracle of the Asia Pacific. So within this, quote, Asiatic racial form, the distinguishing characteristic of East Asian peoples has been excessive economic efficiency. Certainly, this is a continuation of Orientalist exoticization, but the temporal assumptions stand in stark contrast to those of the earlier classical variants. As a shorthand, so this is kind of an exercise, right? As a shorthand, we could distinguish between the traditional Oriental and the hypermodern or the postmodern Asiatic, right? So whereas the Oriental was irrational and superstitious, the Asiatic is calculating. The Oriental referred to a discrete culture. The Asiatic points towards the globalization of goods, capital, and people. The Oriental was archaic and conservative. The Asiatic is future-oriented and progressive. Oriental stereotypes provide an explanation for the degradation of Asia. Asiatic ones point in the opposite direction. East Asia is either a hypermodern civilization that reflects the degradation of the West, and here you can think about articles championing Asia's COVID response, Twitter posts comparing Chinese subways to New York MTA, right? Or conversely, Asia is an economic threat to overtake Euro-America, subsuming it within itself, completing the circuit of Hegel's world spirit from east to west, back to east, right? So the distinction between Oriental and Asiatic, it seems to me at least, roughly maps onto that between the China of the wet market and the China of lab leak. Wet market relied upon antiquated ideas about an uncivilized people. It stood in contradiction with the economic reality of China as a global power, and thus the theory's resonance, I believe, was therefore limited. Lab leak, however, does ring true for many people today. It taps into recurring suspicions that the China of today, behind its inscrutable armies of labor and scientists, is up to something fishy. Lab leak proponents have offered us this basic scenario, so I'll just kind of lay it out. The scenario is that Wuhan Institute virologists collected samples of coronaviruses from bats in Southwest China and then genetically manipulated them. The virus then escaped the lab accidentally or intentionally, and then entered into central Wuhan, laying the foundation for a global pandemic by December 2019. Now, much of the outrage revolves around this attempted cover-up by US agencies that worked with the Wuhan Institute. In June, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul in the US accused Anthony Fauci of lying about his role, quote, obscuring responsibility for the 4 million people around the world dying from a pandemic, end quote. So on the surface, lab leak proponents are mad about dangerous research, or they're mad about lax safety standards and a global cover-up, right? But what is really missing from this explanation is a motive. If this research were so self-evidently dangerous, then what could have possibly justified it? What were those Wuhan scientists up to, right? And the obvious implication is that Chinese researchers were doing something unnatural and therefore nefarious. Rand Paul told Fauci, quote, gain-of-function research is, quote, juicing up naturally occurring animal viruses to infect humans. There was a recent opinion piece in October, so just last month, in the Wall Street Journal that claimed the coronavirus was, quote, cooked up in a lab. Another article describes gain-of-function research as, quote, hot wiring genetics, hot swapping mutant spike proteins, and so on and so on, right? And then obviously these terms disclose this general, overall underlying moral judgment. A more specific accusation, however, can be found from Doctors Richard Mueller and Stephen Key, the authors of that Wall Street Journal op-ed, which I think was released exactly a month ago today, suggesting that the virus itself shows clues of manipulation. So in that Wall Street Journal op-ed, they wrote, quote, "We have an eyewitness, a whistleblower who escaped from Wuhan and carried details of the pandemic's origins that the Chinese Communist Party can't hide. That whistleblower's name is SARS-CoV-2," right? So what are Mueller and Key implying here with this term whistleblower? Well, in fact, Mueller and Key actually laid out their thoughts recently in a new book titled "What Really Happened in Wuhan." This was actually released October 1, so basically 1 month ago, by the Australian journalist Sherry Markson. Mueller first appears in the book complaining that, quote, "the Chinese had taken control over our own scientists' intellectual honesty, openness, and objectivity. They had manipulated us," right? Later in the book, Mueller elaborates his whistleblower theory from Markson. So this is a conversation between the two of them. Mueller says, "The most obvious explanation is that someone in the Wuhan laboratory was a whistleblower." Mueller then pauses. "Have you read the Da Vinci Code?" Markson says, "Who hasn't?" Mueller says, "In the Da Vinci Code, right, someone leaves a clue that can only be read by the right expert. Here's my fantasy. Someone at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was really upset that they were developing a bioweapon. The military had taken control of the laboratory and they were weaponizing viruses. That person has no direct way to get the word out. But if you have a sample of the vaccine and you happen just for 10 seconds to get access to that patient's sample, you put a little bit of the vaccine in there, hoping that someone in the West will notice. That someone would say, 'Oh my God, there's a vaccine in there,' right?" So just to be clear, what is going on in this long quote, right? We have here one of the major scientific authorities lending legitimacy to the lab leak theory, basically positing a fantasy of a deep state cover-up and of a secret Chinese military bioweapons program, basically along the same lines as the plot of the Da Vinci Code. And it should be clear, right? I'm not making any comment here on the scientific evidence for lab leak or wet market. I'm obviously not qualified to talk about that. And from what I can read, like there is no scientific consensus on either one. What does seem clear to me, however, is that the articulation of a lot of these theories are not really based on evidence either, but really about projections and fantasies about what China is and what China is up to. So Markson's book features a lot more speculation. I won't go into the details from United States and Australian security analysts talking about Chinese bioweapons program, again, without any sort of concrete evidence. And putting aside the veracity of all these claims, the point is that this image of China, right, this image conforms much more with the Asiatic racial form than wet market does. The overall impression is not of a barbaric China in decline, but one that is powerful and ambitious. From the outset, according to Lai, the Asiatic subject has been distinguished by its forward-looking orientation, prone to suddenly ascend the ranks of capitalist modernity. Now, the obvious rejoinder to all of this is that much of the critical heat right now is being placed not on China, but on those US scientists such as Dr. Fauci. But again, unlike the classical Oriental, the modern Asiatic is part of a global network of elites. Modern representations of the Asiatic, according to Aiko Day, another literary scholar, modern representations of the Asiatic take on the properties of modern capital itself: abstract, intangible, invisible, borderless, right? So if in the Gilded Age, Asian migrants were accused of colluding with monopoly capital, or today they're rigging high school and college entrance exams, right? Then Markson is also accusing China of global conspiracies, siphoning US money to fund Chinese modernization, and pressuring scientists. She concludes the book, quote, "So was this a cover-up to hide culpability for a virus leak or just evidence of a new world order," right? So all these quotes might sound like fringe conspiracy theory, but again, these are part of the mainstream conversation about lab leak that is, in the Wall Street Journal, for instance. But further, the lab leak is just one example, I think, of broader sentiments that have been floating around, if you've been looking for them, floating around in very mundane forms throughout the pandemic. For instance, in May of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, the education minister of Brazil was quoted to say that COVID-19 was part of China's, quote, infallible plan for world domination. At the same time, last spring, there were incidents, or there were reports of arsonists in the UK who set fire to wireless towers in 30 locations, totaling 80 incidents of damage provoked by an internet theory that COVID had spread through wireless 5G technology built by the Chinese company Huawei, right? And that is a kind of extreme example of sort of Luddite behavior, but on a more mundane level, governments across Western Europe, Asia, and now the United States have all banned contracts with Huawei, obviously, for fear of spying. In the United States, there's also an ongoing Department of Justice program called the China Initiative that is racially profiling scientists of Asian origin. At NYU, my friends have told me that there are 2 professors at NYU in the medical school who have been more or less fired or suspended without any evidence or legal process, right? So these are things to consider. These are basically happening all over the place in all sorts of different forms. All of these scenarios conform with recent surveys showing that public opinion towards China has plummeted in recent years, and this has more or less been coincided with, or has been simultaneous with, the perception of China's ascent, right? In one survey of rich countries in Europe and Asia, nearly all the respondents originally held positive views of China in 2002. By 2020, they were all resoundingly negative, reaching lows across the UK, the US, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, South Korea, Spain, Canada, and the most negative is in Japan. The same survey also asked respondents which country they felt was now the world's dominant economic power. The overwhelming majority, Australia, Canada, most of Western Europe, chose not the US, but China, right? And in a separate survey, it was discovered that across Western Europe, the lab leak theory was just as popular or just as accepted, if not more so, than the theory of natural transfer, right? The zoonosis theory. Now, there are many reasons for the wider acceptance of the lab leak theory this summer, but I think it's hard to ignore just how much the theory is resonant with this burgeoning negative sentiments towards China as an economic power. So my wager is that it is this China, rather than a generic Orient, that is the major basis for racial stereotype today. And if I am right, then I think this points to several conclusions, right, of analysis, right? First, domestically speaking, many in the United States have tried to tell this story, especially in the spring, of a sort of uniquely American, uniquely national history of white supremacy and anti-Asian racism from 1882 China's exclusion to the murders in Atlanta this spring, right? But to me, it seems pretty clear that the dynamics today, especially, are global in character, and they cannot be reduced to something specific to the United States, right? Secondly, these sentiments did not originate from the pandemic, but rather the reverse. The pandemic crystallized and sharpened 2 decades of burgeoning antagonism, giving expression to fears of Chinese domination. And third, although epithets like Kung flu or Wuhan virus, although these were very shocking and certainly vulgar and racist, it would be myopic to attribute too much causal power to these terms, as in the Washington Post piece. It would be myopic to attribute power to them without connecting them to the material contradictions of China's sudden economic ascent. So for instance, the argument that is outlined by Colleen Lai, the Asiatic racial form was significant as a fetishized representation of reality that enables the management of social, which is to say class struggle, or put bluntly, race short circuits an analysis of global capital. Another way of putting it is this, right, that in modern history, much of the sentiments undergirding anti-Asian racism begin as a form of anti-capitalism, to be right. And that's kind of a profound or sobering realization to think about the sort of inextricability of sentiments towards Asia and also the sort of undergirding political economic forces that are supporting that. So in other words, we often will take the effects, or we perceive the effects of economic change, of flows of labor and capital, but we perceive them as a collection of races and cultures. This provides convenient, just so explanations for the social disjunctures of our time. Liberal calls for tolerance amount to calls to suppress these racial forms. Now, these are of course important, but they also avoid the underlying reason we need racial forms to begin with, the very problems we're trying to diagnose and explain, right? Instead, it strikes me as far more valuable to directly confront them in our own thinking, right? So to summarize this, this first section, this basic point, the controversy over the wet market and lab leak theories disclosed to us that this racialization of East Asians today is less along the lines of a traditional Oriental, a generic perpetual foreigner, and it's more about the specific type, an inscrutable conspiratorial embodiment of globalization itself, reified into a discrete group. Now, that's sort of the first argument, and we can kind of argue and debate that on its own merits. The separate question, of course, is, well, what do we do about it? How can we confront this and challenge this effectively? And my idea is that we could begin by challenging this idea of China itself, not as economically powerful, because of course it is, right? But we can challenge this idea that China is some sort of behemoth that stands apart and above or behind or underneath the global economy, things that are happening in the rest of the world. Instead, it is more useful to think of China as one theater, albeit a major theater, within which broader global forces are playing out, right? So in other words, China faces the same constraints of interdependence as everyone else. Now, many state actions are therefore not only demonstrations of power, but also attempts to ward off the threats of crisis and vulnerability shared by the rest of the world. Thus, for instance, most commentary on China today focuses on the encroaching power of the state. This often assumes the form of human rights discourse about the abject treatment of minorities and peripheral territories, Mongolia, Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and to be clear, these are entirely valid. In terms of economic reporting, we have publications such as the Wall Street Journal that fixate on the gradual state takeover of the so-called private economy. All of these ideas, however, exoticize the Chinese state as uniquely powerful or uniquely different from practices in Euro-America. As Ho Feng Hung has argued, however, hostility between China and the US is not a spontaneous reaction to authoritarianism, but is really a byproduct of the 2000s and specifically the 2008 financial crisis. In the 90s, liberal reformers in China pushed for ascension into the WTO and reshaped the economy in line with neoliberal standards. In the 2000s, Ye Tan has argued there was a reverse movement towards greater state intervention. Like the Great Depression, the 2008 crisis heightened China's disillusionment with free market capitalism. As in the US, the Chinese state staved off collapse through a massive stimulus in China worth about 580 billion RMB. The key point is that China's interventions since 2008 are not only a sign of Chinese power, but also of its vulnerability. By the 2010s, signs were emerging of an overaccumulation crisis in which the abundance of capital is stymied by a lack of productive outlets. The result is the excessive construction of, for instance, railway systems and housing developments with nobody willing to ride or live inside them, memorably captured in the imagery of Chinese ghost cities, glamorous new urban projects that ultimately remain empty today. Fears of crisis explain another controversial direction, the Belt and Road Initiative, or more generally, efforts to invest into developing markets. Chinese investment here is not just a sign of greed and ideology, it is also mainly a defensive mechanism against domestic slowdown. This, of course, does not make it any less offensive to the locals who suffer consequences. So if this past decade, the 2010s, was a decade marked by state-backed stimulus and overinvestment, then the Chinese state of 2021 has asserted even greater control, reining in market forces, targeting corporate debt, regulating labor, pursuing decarbonization. Headline-grabbing stories, the ones that we probably have all seen in the news, such as the scrapped IPO for Ant Financial Group last winter, and also last month's collapse of the Evergrande Group, which is the country's second largest developer, but the most indebted one. All of these can be seen as part of the state's goals to enforce fiscal discipline. The global perception of Chinese omnipotence, therefore, is out of joint with the actual existing reality of global unevenness, vulnerability and exposure, and the constant specter of crisis. Further illustration of this can be found in the sort of the way that we are, the headline-grabbing stories of the global supply chains, which we could perhaps talk about later in conversation with Charmaine. But for now, for time's sake, I'm just going to kind of jump towards the conclusion and zoom back out, and back up and zoom back out. So again, earlier, many argued correctly that we should not pathologize COVID-19 as a virus of Chinese culture or the Chinese people, for its global scale meant that it was truly a virus enabled by global capital. Conversely, then, we should also be skeptical of any imagery of an exceptionally dominant China, whether as a fantasy by leftists, so-called leftists, right, and Chinese nationalists, or as a dystopian threat to the rest of the world, whether as conspiracy theory or as mundane racism. China does not stand above and beyond or behind or underneath the global economy. Its ascent has coincided with deepening interdependence, especially with the US. What the pandemic has shown in all of its stages, from the initial outbreak to the current global chaos, is that China cannot transcend the global division of labor any more than the rest of the world can, without cutting itself off and committing massive economic self-harm. For China, as for the rest of the world, there are no clear answers. But this is perhaps the clearest repudiation of any explanation, such as the New York Times piece I quoted earlier, that rely upon cultural or racial exceptionalism. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that is good grist for conversation with everyone else.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was amazing and just rich and layered and gives us so much to talk about. Just a reminder to folks that if you would like to ask a question, you can do so now or at any time as we talk in the Q&A box. And this gives us about, I think, 20-25 minutes to chat. So hopefully we'll be able to take some of these questions. So Andy, if I may maybe just start with one question that picks up on where you left off. One of the things you kind of indicated towards the end of your talk is the way in which this overaccumulation crisis that the US experienced between the 1960s to 80s is now something that China is not immune from, and is in effect affecting them as well. And I think in a way, part of what you're helping us think through is the way that when the conversation about US-China is figured as a geopolitical one, as a one of Cold War politics, it obscures the fact that China is inserted into a global capitalist market from which it is sort of prone to the similar kinds of contradictions, internal contradictions that the rest of the world is in terms of capitalist tendencies for the falling profit rate. So I guess, to kind of like zoom out from there and zoom back into the supply chain crisis, the great supply chain crisis we're all in. I was on KQED a couple of weeks ago talking about this, and I made similar comments, right, about how we need to situate this within the context of just-in-time capitalism. And all of the callers who called in from San Francisco pretty much yelled at me and said, like, how dare you? It's possible to buy local. I can't get my couch from my interior design firm on time. So on one end of the spectrum, there's this kind of liberal consumerist panic, right, about the supply chain, essentially drawing the conclusion that the problem is that what we now need to do is buy our Christmas presents early. And then on the other end is this kind of part of the spectrum in which economists are increasingly speculating about the necessity of deglobalizing supply chains, bringing that market back to the US, and fanned by these fantasies about the possibility of a return to Made in America. All of this, of course, seems to revivify the kind of specter of a moral panic over our dependency on Chinese manufacturing, right? And so I find that so interesting because even though our collective reliance on Chinese-made goods, as you're pointing out, in the industrialized North, isn't really about some vague omnipotence of the Chinese economy, but it's actually dependent on the exploitation of Chinese labor, it sort of still becomes, parroted through the formation of Asia as a racialized threat and as a future-oriented hypermodern state that's sort of set against the degradation of our ability to supply our own goods, et cetera. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about the supply chain crisis. What don't we understand about it in the context of this argument about situating China within the global market? And how would you respond, I suppose, to the kind of, the spectrums of response to the crisis that I laid out?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I think that is just to kind of first address your San Francisco callers on KQED, which is probably the worst audience to discuss this with, right? But I do think that kind of points to this dilemma where I don't really know what the way out is, and maybe you have better thoughts on this, right? Where you're kind of stuck between, there is a sense that this just-in-time system is not good, right? That it's exploitative, it's bad for nature, it's bad for the planet, and it is this kind of race to the bottom that we shouldn't do anymore, and therefore we should go back to buying local and making things in the U.S. And I have these thoughts all the time, like how I should make something myself instead of buying it from Amazon and so on. But then, obviously undergirding that sentiment is this kind of reactionary nationalist sentiment. And I think one of the things I was kind of trying to say in this talk, and maybe wasn't that clear, was that again, a lot of anti-Asian, but we could also just say like reactionary sentiments are anti-capitalists at the outset, at their sentiment, right? And that is something that should make us pause and think about, like, how do we deal with this moment where it seems like everyone's kind of sick of neoliberalism, right? And I think there is a natural response to say, that's great. Everyone hates neoliberalism. We're going to have this revolution now, right? But obviously that can go in all sorts of reactionary directions. Historically, it has gone in a lot of reactionary directions. So I don't really know what the way out is. And for someone who studied this a lot more than I have, I'd be curious what your thoughts are about the way out of just in time and globalization and all that stuff. But in terms of some of the details and some of the stuff, I didn't talk about before, I think what comes out of just kind of searching the reports, economic reports or logistics reports this past year is that as of the middle of the summer, there was a lot of this sentiment from last year into the summer that China had won the pandemic, that they were the first major economy to report positive GDP growth. This was back in the last quarter of 2020. And there was an article in the middle of last summer that I think makes it so clear. The headline is how China became the big winner of COVID-19, and specifically focusing on both the US consumption of Chinese made goods and also the fact that with all this demand for shipping containers, China makes 97% of shipping containers also, right? So if there's greater demand for these, literally the infrastructure itself, China will profit off of that. It seems like the Delta variant basically broke all this, right? It made the system, it finally broke the system in a way that not just certain countries, but like all countries, right, are now really just suffering from a system that by very nature is interdependent, right? So on the one hand, China is doing this controversial zero COVID policy where they are freezing these ports based on one case of COVID, right? Putting that aside though, let's say hypothetically, most of these Chinese factories that make, shoes or chemicals or like computer parts, electronic parts, or steel, right? Let's say these factories are healthy, the workers are healthy, right? But they rely upon outside sources for the raw materials. And they also rely upon the transportation to bring stuff into China and out of China and bring it from the US back to China and so on and so forth. So it's all these sort of external factors that means China is also equally exposed to the vulnerability and the same sort of problems as everyone else. Just the reading reports, like if Malaysia shuts down, that hurts palm oil and tin. If Vietnam shuts down, that hurts footwear and apparel production. If Thailand shuts down, this shuts down a lot of the auto parts that go into the automobiles that are made in China, and so on. And so the other thing that I was kind of that is also out there is that the Chinese state. This is what's been in the news the last few weeks or the last year, basically. The Chinese state is actually making an effort to turn away from this export-oriented model, and which has driven them to a lot of corporate debt with that stimulus package, and with the '08 crisis kind of really driving home this point that if you over-depend upon American consumers, right, then you're exposed to when the American economy goes to shit. So there are these like slogans like dual circulation or common prosperity, where the Chinese state is trying to reorient its economy towards domestic consumption, but they can't right now because of this global demand, because of all these orders that are coming in from overseas. So in a lot of ways, this omnipotent Chinese state is actually being stymied by this global market. Like they aren't, this isn't a conspiracy where they're trying to mastermind the global supply chain. They themselves are also, their hands are also tied by all this, global interdependence and delays and so on and so forth. So I think, those are ways to indicate that the Chinese state is not this omnipotent force that it is, what they're attempting to do is also being stymied by the sort of same forces that are stymieing our Christmas supplies, our Christmas gifts.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I think, one thing that connects where you ended your presentation about Evergrande and to connect it to the Ever Given and to supply chain crises is that one of the offshoots of a kind of just-in-time capitalist model is really also grounded in obsessions with return on equity in modern finance. That's deeply connected to the supply chain. So the big winners of the COVID crisis are not necessarily countries, so to speak, but actually the shipping companies whose, where the pricing of containerization has shot up. And many of these companies are not choosing to put that into capital investments. They're turning 97% of those profits into dividends to returns to investors, right? And so there's a way in which the just-in-timeness of everything has over time incentivized a model of lean manufacturing and lean stock that has meant that we've stripped all of the kinds of various shock absorbers of the economy in pursuit of these kinds of short-term metrics of return on investments,
Right.
which means that we lack chassis, we lack containers, we lack excess capacity. And all of this is, of course, deadly consequences, even for particular forms that are, sort of not Christmas presents, but PPE and, COVID hospital beds are based on the same kind of just-in-time supply chain model, in which, almost full capacity is sort of what brings returns. But I guess I wanted to turn to this brilliant point that you make, in which anti-Asian racism is actually begins the form of anti-capitalism. That anti-Asian racism becomes a kind of way to cathect anxieties and fears and disappointments around neoliberalism and the failures of capitalism onto a kind of racialized subject of threat. If we kind of take into account the forms of supply chain crisis, and particularly the forms of them that require exploited workers paying most of the cost, right? So, the Thai economy is not just hurting because workers are not able to go to the factories and getting infected. In fact, Thailand just announced this thing called Factory Sandbox, where they have announced that they're going to quarantine all workers, many of whom are migrants, in the factories themselves, right, until they can get tested. So I guess I wonder if you have thoughts about what this kind of insight, right, that anti-Asian racism is actually anti-capitalist, might help us think about in terms of a left internationalist project that, on the one hand, should sort of not take the line of a kind of tanky defense of the Chinese nationalism that I think many people are prey to, but might actually think about internationalism in other forms that perhaps might think alongside supply chains, or might think alongside how we might move away from this kind of geopolitical narrative towards thinking about working class people everywhere.
Yeah, thanks. That's that is the question where, like, if I had a clear answer, I would have a book, written about this. Let me first say, like, that the sentiment, that insight, I have to give credit to, Colleen Lai and Aiko Day in Asian and Asian American literature. They kind of were the ones who kind of make this argument very clearly in their respective works. And so in a lot of ways, but just like you, I thought, well, that is actually a really productive way to think about these questions. And I think that insight itself, right, that anti-Asian racism is modern anti-Asian racism, let's say, right, to distinguish it from the sort of backwards Edward Said variant. But probably most forms of racism are inseparable from the economic content of those racisms. I think that's more or less, fine. Like, I think you and I agree on this, right? But the question obviously is, how do you overcome it? And this is like the question that comes up over and over. The very standard response is like, well, we should put aside our racial and ethnic and sexual and whatever differences and realize we're all workers and so on, right? But this is, and maybe that's the correct solution, I don't know. But I would say, like, what I'm trying, the wager, or the sort of the reason I was kind of going this route in this paper was to say, like, it's not enough to just suppress race, or to say, like, let's just not think about race, because that is basically a liberal call for tolerance, which doesn't get at the fact that racism gives voice to those very real contradictions, economic contradictions that you can't just wish away through like calls for tolerance. So my hope was that by thinking about China, which is this kind of reification of a people and of a state, we could take what appears on the surface to be this very self-explanatory entity, and then probe and dissect and think about, actually, there is no such thing as a China as such. It is really just this amalgamation of global forces. As far as but this is like the academic move, right? How do we understand this stuff better? I'm not really sure exactly like if there's a way to, I would say that the very basic starting point would be something like making the clear argument that China is, if you want to say it's a capitalist country or a capitalist state or whatever, it is a country subject to the forces of capitalism, right? And many people do make this argument. A lot of my friends in the academy make this argument, but that does not seem to be the mainstream argument in either the left or the right. And so I think even before we get to this end game of like, how do we organize the international proletariat, right? Which, that seems like to be a game of speculation at this point, right? The starting point, I think, especially in English language literature, would be to push back against the idea that China is this exotic system that is not capitalist, that is an alternative to neoliberalism or capitalism, so on. And so, for instance, I know there's like a series of talks coming out from the Transnational Institute that is going to talk a lot about what is the Chinese economic system, what is the Chinese political system, and why, and kind of featuring people who actually study China on its own terms. For whatever reason, I think I could say this, right? I know personally or from firsthand that there does seem to be a lot of pushback within the US left of these ideas that China is a capitalist system, or China is a society subject to the same forces of capitalism as the rest of the world. I'm not really sure why that is the case. I think they have to get into the sort of psychology of the US left or the global left to understand why. But, that seems to be the dominant idea now. And so I guess the kind of baby steps I was trying to put forward in this talk is, well, let's at least just start with saying China is also subject to capitalism and it is not this thing that's outside of it. And I don't know, I think that itself is already like would be a major first step for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I have 3 questions in the Q&A, which I'm gonna try to ask. And since it's 4:24 and we don't have that much time, maybe you could keep responses relatively short. Does that work for you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Abram Miller asks, Prof. Liu, may I ask you to comment on the role of the CCP in contributing to xenophobia or the lab leak theory kind of thinking? In that China does not have to deal with political divisiveness, human rights issues, or forms of accountability that Western society must otherwise deal with.
I think they do, though. I'm not really sure. If the argument is that the Chinese state controls media, fair enough point, right? Like it is obviously a much more censored public sphere, but there is all sorts of labor organization and protests and all sorts of civil society protests that happen in China, but they're kind of underneath the radar. And they might happen on, the internet before they get suppressed in real life. But certainly, I think these sort of like absolute exoticization of China is distinct from the problems that all other societies face, I think is something that could be debunked if you look more closely at what's actually going on.
Thanks. And then we've got a question from Jay Kang. What do you think we can learn from the fact that private equities such as BlackRock are given prize positions within the Chinese economy, or that companies like Koch Industries rely heavily on so-called free trade, versus the fact that clearly there are more nationalist elite factions that are willing to engage in a kind of soft cold warriorism with Biden? What, if any, positive roles do you see the US state playing?
Sorry, let me think about what do you think we can learn from the fact that private equity are given prize positions?
I guess I would understand this question as suggesting that on the one hand, we benefit from China's position within the world economy in that, private equity and Koch Industries rely on free trade in order to invest in China, versus the fact that elite nationalist factions, I think maybe they mean
I see.
On the US and Chinese side, are willingly engaging in the kind of Cold War narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a clear answer to this, but what strikes me as like, this is, having just read a book about, Mei Nai's new book about anti-Chinese sentiments in the 19th century, this is the same relative formation of the 19th century, which is US capital likes China because of all the profit they can profit from exploiting the cheap labor and exploiting cheap goods made in China. But it is the US worker, quote unquote, which is to say basically the non-elite, who are the ones who are very much riling up anti-Asian sentiments and are xenophobic and so on. So this isn't a new formation. It's actually kind of predictable that the economic and people smarter than me about the United States have talked about this, that obviously the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the elite, whatever you want to call it, there's different factions, right? And there are going to be factions that are much more globalist, to use the Steve Bannon term, right, than nationalist, than state-centric, and they aren't really wedded to any sort of US project. And I think that's to be expected. The fears of, and Ho Fang Hung in his article that you can find on Jacobin, has kind of made this clear distinction. In the 90s, it was the security people and the human rights people who wanted to demonize China. It was actually the Silicon Valley and Wall Street that wanted to keep the lines of communication with China open. And that is why there was this sort of honeymoon period with China in the 90s and the 2000s. Precisely because China now seems to be rewriting the rules of the global economy, that the security human rights faction of the United States state has suddenly like gotten louder, and the global elite are perhaps less protective. If Facebook weren't banned in China, maybe Mark Zuckerberg would care a lot more about protecting it. But because Facebook is banned, maybe Mark Zuckerberg's like, fuck it, like whatever, let's go after China. So that's contradiction between the sort of pro international capitalist elite versus the state. That's an old contradiction.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I wonder if this question actually leads into it. So somebody asks, the crackdown on large tech firms and crypto in China has been viewed by some in the West as a fruitful exercise of state power, which the West could emulate. Is there a way to view this supposed state strength as also a state weakness, similar to the Chinese state's fiscal tightening?
Yeah, so I think it is obviously a sign of strength that the Chinese state can do this in a way that many other states cannot. But obviously, if you look at the motivations, why are they doing it? It is precisely because this fear of what happens when these companies kind of snowball and get out of control. The clearest example, the one that I kind of read the most about, is the Ant Financial Group, or Alibaba, right? Where Alibaba, I think it was like an eBay at some point, but it basically started becoming like what we know as not just like a Venmo, but also like a Rocket Mortgage, like handing out all sorts of consumer credit at very low rates and being a very leveraged company as a result. And it was precisely that kind of Pandora's box of unleashing consumer and corporate debt into the economy that was really what freaked out the Chinese state. Because, as we saw with Evergrande, the Evergrande kind of clamping down the last month or so, the Chinese state knows that, these too much debt in the economy is bad, right? Because that's just deferring the fact that eventually you have to pay off this debt. And if there isn't actually a quote unquote sound economy underneath, then things could collapse, right? So they know they've unleashed a lot of debt since 2008, and now I think they're trying to clean it up. And so the crackdown on Ant, for instance, was obviously a sign of strength, but is also a reflection of they know that they are vulnerable and that they want to clean up and they want to change directions away from relying on debt and state-backed finance too much. So, again, it's a paradox or it's a contradiction where, like, obviously the state has many more powers, like right now, that it could unleash, but at the same time, this isn't to say that somehow there's this discrete thing called the Chinese economy that they're in charge of. They're in fact, again, prone to all the things that all other economies are prone to.
Andy, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, if only too brief. We are, I think, largely out of time, but I might take moderator's prerogative to just ask you one last question, if that's okay. So we've talked quite a bit about sort of what it might, mean to take a leftist internationalist stance on our relation to China. And I suppose I want to ask you about the climate piece that you kind of briefly indicated in your earlier comments. So one of the conversations around China's cemented position as factory of the world might on the one hand be about sort of China trying to manage those contradictions now. But another, I suppose, is the fact that as we talk about these supply chain crises and these real estate crises, there's not a ton of conversation about what it might mean to either pursue a kind of policy of degrowth or to imagine the supply chain or the global economy as anything other than what it already is.
Yeah.
And we obviously are facing a kind of climactic time in which a failure to respond, to even imagine what a degrowth approach might look like, I think is going to be precipitous at a planetary scale.
Right.
I just wonder if you want to close us off with some thoughts about what that might mean for our thinking about internationalism once again.
Yeah. So one small point, one concrete detail would be looking at some of these problems that China is facing. One of the economic issues is a man-made, a state-created issue, which is the state is actually trying to implement these ambitious plans to decarbonize. They're placing restrictions on coal and fossil fuel production, and that is increasing energy costs, and that is contributing to this whole this kind of inflation fuck up that's happening with everything else. And that is kind of the dilemma, right? If one economy or one government just tries to do it on their own, then all these other forces conspire against them. And more generally, I was thinking about this earlier with regards to this global supply chain dilemma of like, well, what is the solution? Should we promote globalization, like maybe a more robust version of globalization, or should we revert back to made in USA or local production and so on? But if you think about all the problems of just in time and all the problems of all this stuff is like, well, globalization has made a lot of things convenient and readily available for all your San Francisco callers, right? But at the same time, it has made a lot of people not much richer, right? It still relies upon a very exploitative race to the bottom logic. And so the only real way to the change of the sort of third alternative one that you're kind of suggesting is, well, like, we don't really need this much clothing, right? We don't need this many electronics. We don't need all the consumer goods. A lot of these things are obviously part of a state of an economic program by both countries and many countries to promote economic growth, regardless of like physical need and utility and all of those things, right? So it does seem like a non-economic intervention would be necessary. A political one, climate could be the sort of natural or the physical intervention, right? But obviously economic logic itself, which is abstract and divorced from like the physical materiality of the world, is not going to stop on its own, right? It would continue the sort of as expansive as possible, as race to the bottom as possible, as fast as possible, right? So some sort of non-economic response. And I don't know. I mean, I guess what you're pointing at is like, is there a possibility for a sort of global political pushback on just in time in these supply chains? And in theory, right, the foundation is there, with climate change and with the sort of shared crisis of the present. But the question is always like, well, how do you convert those material conditions into political effectiveness?
Yeah, you've left us with such hard questions that we can only begin to start thinking about. But I want to thank you again, Dr. Andrew Liu, for this amazing talk and wonderful set of comments. Thanks also to David Sugarman for organizing, to NYU Skirball, to Don and Melissa, and thank you to Verso and N+1 for organizing.
Yeah.